Hey parents, welcome to another disciple making video. So today we're going to be looking at chapter 21, and last week we talked about praying and how do we do this ultimately with ourselves, because it has to start with us first.
Right.
But today what we're going to be talking about is how do we engage our kids in doing this? How do we begin to teach them to pray? And so, of course, it starts at one level and it will build upon each other as our students and our kids
Right.
grow up. But
Right.
that's what we're going to be talking about today, and I'm excited about this conversation because last week I know we talked about the Acts way to do it. So, the adoration, confession, thanksgiving, supplication, and there's two parts of that supplication. So we talked a little bit about that last week, but I want to actually go a little deeper. And how do we physically do this, especially at a younger age, start getting our kids to pray? So, Casey, what are your thoughts on, really Acts, and how do we actually implement some of the other methods that we have in teaching our kids how to pray?
I think Acts is such a good way to teach it, especially like you talked about it last week. Because I know when kids pray most of the time, they either pray just like we as parents pray, or they just pray for the scary things to not come their way, like whatever it may be. And it's usually, Lord, help me, or fix this, or I want to sleep tonight, or sometimes
That's how it starts off.
that's a lot of times how it starts off. Now, I want to give the benefit of the doubt. Some kids, I've heard some really great prayers
Oh, yeah.
that were like, wow, that's really thoughtful. But most of the time it's not. And so the Acts method, if we can think about, adoring God, giving praise to God first, and then teaching them to confess, which that might be a struggle. That is a little more complex of a thing, but still, if you've said you're sorry throughout the day for something or had to apologize, to, confess that, and then to think of those things to give thanksgiving for, which again, my kids are pretty good in that area. Thank you for this. Thank you for this. Thank you for this. And so that's one that we wouldn't have to work on as much as probably the adoration and confession. But, and then the last thing is praying for the needs. I really liked, wasn't it last week we talked about praying not just for yourself in supplication, but for the needs of others.
That's right.
And I know a lot of our Wedgwood parents, maybe other parents that are watching this, whether you attend Wedgwood or not, really maybe haven't often taught your kids, or maybe they do teach their kids to pray for others. Of needs of our neighbors or people at school, our teachers. And to me, with children, it's breaking it down a little bit simpler, and it really works out well, helping their minds think about something that doesn't come natural. But the other thing is, I think sometimes we just need a method like Acts, but also maybe something even a little simpler. And something that is a real simple method could be the idea of just getting a notebook and writing out some things, and maybe writing out some cues like Acts, and asking your kids to just jot something down by each of those things, just one thing that you want to say in adoration, or to adore God, to love God, one thing in confession. Letting them writing it out would probably be easier than actually having them say, hey, tonight, Patrick, you're leading our prayer time.
Yeah, see, that seems to me, if you actually give me something in front of me where I can go, okay, this is the adoration, confession, thanksgiving, supplication, and even the two-part of supplication.
Yeah.
Like, I am much more comfortable.
Yeah.
And I'm also in my mid-20s, so, I've been able to be on the spot a little bit more than some of our kids and students have. But if I'm also just asked, hey, just do this, just off the cuff, I can only imagine what a child would feel during that time. It would be overwhelming.
A lot of times I think that's how kids feel. And sadly, I still do that to my kids sometimes. Like, hey, you're praying tonight. And sometimes they're with it and sometimes they're not. But I think you're spot on that it does feel a little bit overwhelming to just be, hey, pray tonight. Or, hey, pray right now for whatever. And so, again, give them a method of being able to pray as you are teaching them. Because, as parents, maybe we've already thought through how we do it, and we're so used to doing it that when we're trying to break it down for maybe an elementary age, maybe a middle school, I don't know where you're at, maybe even, high school level, if we haven't ever started this journey of just finding out what works for your child at what age they are. Or maybe we have some grandparents listening. Even if your grandparents, the grandkids are at your house, or maybe they live with you, again, to just think about what might connect with them on their level. Another idea is index cards. If a big piece of paper might be overwhelming, breaking it down one thing a day. by having index cards. So today we're just going to think about adoration, keeping it simpler rather than trying to do all of Acts, which as adults, I think we can do, but can kids always do that? But
Right, and I think another thing that we have to remember is that we've been doing stuff like this for years.
yeah,
And sometimes it's stuff that we grew up with, and we
Right.
started, our parents started with us at that young age. And I think sometimes we forget that.
Yeah.
Hey, you know what? We got to spend the time and teach them how to do that as well. The other part of that too, with the index cards, I love that idea, and especially with like my little kids. So I have a 3-year-old and a 1.5-year-old, and just giving them one index card of one thing might be really beneficial for them. That's something I'm thinking about. How do we do that well? I also think that maybe we do it together and bringing them in, because that was something we talked about last week. And I think that this is exactly what you're kind of inferring, to build upon each other. And so as you get comfortable doing those one index card of just one letter, maybe doing another one.
Well, maybe a 3-year-old, maybe a 1.5-year-old. Draw a picture on the index card.
Oh, absolutely, because they can't write. I mean, so
Right.
But you know what? We can remember a story. We can remember different characters and draw in pictures, and that's another great way to build those heart connections, as we referred back to in this disciple making parent video.
Absolutely.
So I mean, all of these are different methods. Here's the deal: you can read book after book after book, and you can find the best method in book A, B, C, and D. The reality is the best method is the one that you use and the one that you stick with.
Yeah.
And so if Acts works for you, wonderful. I'm excited. This is actually one of my favorite ones to use.
Sure.
But you know what? It may be, just walking through the Lord's Prayer in Matthew and going through and looking at how do we pray. Or it could be taking some index cards or a piece of paper.
Right.
I mean, all of these are different types of methods, and we're not tied to a direct method. Well, we definitely have our favorites because the ones that we're more comfortable with and we actually implement more and more. So, but I just want to encourage you, it's all about starting somewhere and building upon that and letting that grow. And then as it grows, I want to kind of transition a little bit to what does this look like in teenagers' life.
Oh, yeah.
So I know you're in children's ministry, but you are a student pastor as well, before even here in Texas, or not in Fort Worth.
Being at Wedgwood.
Right, being at Wedgwood. So, so we can both kind of talk about this issue here and how to really pray deeper, because I think a lot of times in our prayer, we just kind of get mundane. It becomes the dinner time prayer or the prayer before nighttime.
Right.
And we kind of lose the value of what we're really doing. At least seeing the value in it.
Yeah, I thought what was interesting is Pastor Dell, I think it was maybe 2 Sundays ago, talked about if you took out your prayer time for meals and maybe bedtime prayers, how much other prayer time would you have during the day? And to me, that was a really good question that maybe all of my kids, teenage, 5th grade and 1st grade, were able to really think about. And even us as parents. And so I think that that's such a good question. If you were to take that out, how much time? And the goal is, prayer is our communication with God. It's our relationship channel, connection, and so, for these teenage years, I think it is helping them understand that, which again, if you maybe have a 13, 14-year-old, it's getting them to grasp onto that, to start not just, again, praying at bedtime, or praying for meals, but how do you grow into that deeper relationship?
Absolutely. And I think a great place to start is actually with Scripture, ultimately. We're going to be praying with really in the Spirit, but ultimately knowing more about Christ, knowing more about how God works, with the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and how they're all working together, gives us a deeper love for God. And ultimately, because of that, we have a deeper understanding of who they are, so we can pray more intently or intentionally. And so I think that for the adoration part, that's huge. And then confession part, when we're younger, some of the confession part might actually be a little easier, because it's like, well, why did you do this? Well, I pushed my brother down. Why? Because he had my toy. In a way, it can be simpler. And at that point, we're a little bit more open to kind of admitting some of this. as we get older, we like to kind of close that in. We don't want our failures to come out because we want to be, on the outside looking great.
Right.
I think social media plays a big part into this, and because we can have a life on social media that really isn't the life that we live on a day-to-day basis. And so bringing us to a place where we're able to see, like in teenagers' life, of saying, you know what, like I really messed up here, and I don't really know what to do, and it's embarrassing.
Yeah.
Because that's the other part. But here's the reality that, from even while I was a student all the way up until now, our students face the same struggles. And the majority of them are engaging in the same thing. I would even go as far to say close to 90% of them are doing that.
Wow.
And so just because of and that's of course not empirical. It's just kind of what we've seen and experiential.
Right.
But I remember there's been some retreats we've been on where we've talked about different sins that we all struggle with as men and as women. And we've even done the whole close your eyes and not raise your hand if you struggle with this, and you'll be amazed by almost everyone raises their hand, and they're struggling with the same thing. And so we can take some of these things to really confess and ask for forgiveness for, but also intercede on the behalf of our peers.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a certain level of growing deeper in this prayer life that it begins to take less of a shape on how what are my needs as much.
Right.
I don't think we lessen the confession. I think that's always going to be a high priority that we need to engage in. But as far as supplication goes,
right,
I think that the focus should become less on us and more on others as we begin to grow in our own relationship.
Well, I think one of the things I heard while you were saying that is in teenage years, there's probably going to be a lot of crisis situations, or at least it feels like it.
Absolutely.
And that as adults, we also face that. Just the other day, my car wouldn't crank at first. And I thought I didn't know what I was going to do. I felt a little bit in a crisis mode. And I think a lot of times in those teenage years, it's little hurts, it's little things, it's things that were said or things that were done either at school or with friends or maybe even at church. Yeah. And so, that's what I heard. It just sounded like you were talking about. That's going to be, it may not always be our crisis or your child's crisis. It could be, I know so-and-so is going through this time of crisis. So, learning to pray for others that are going through something. Also, maybe when you're going through it, remember to pray, or finding those folks that are going to encourage you in adult life, in teenage life, anytime through life, that those folks are going to be your crisis prayer partners.
Absolutely. It shows a lot of compassion.
Yeah.
And I think that's a characteristic that we're all striving to have, because I think it does reflect Christ. He was a compassionate Christ. And so, when it comes to this, I love how we're beginning to take that shift from, hey, let's be so focused on ourselves.
Right.
To now let's be focused on our peers, but also in the same way deal with it together.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I love about the church, is that it's the body of believers coming together. And so the need of people in our life that are going to be walking alongside with us during this time is so vital. So with that, in our student ministry, specifically here at Wedgwood, we want to have a couple of different relationships. We want them to have a relationship with their leader. We want them to have a relationship with me as a student minister. We want them to have a relationship with definitely their parents, if not that would be the most important relationship, but also some other people in our church that are outside the student ministry.
Yeah.
And so as we kind of build those relationships, one of the big goals of that is that to be like that 3:00 friend, and sadly we've had to face some of that in the past semester. And so who do you call when you're in crisis mode, or when things are going wrong, or where there's a possibility of things going wrong?
Right.
And how are we going to support each other in that? So, be thinking of, hey, who is that for you? But also be thinking here as well as, who are you praying and trying to be that for as well?
Yeah. So, this has been, to me, a great chapter as we talk about last week, praying ourselves has got to be where it starts.
Oh, absolutely.
But then as we talk about teaching our kids to pray, think simple for younger kids. If you have a teenager, you're thinking a little more complex. Outside of, that's what I heard us saying is it's not all about you. You always got to lift yourself up and have the relationship and connection but there's times of crisis, there's times of praising, there's times where we need our 3 o'clock friend. And, the main thing of today is any step you take to praying more with your family, with your teenagers, with your elementary, maybe even with your newborn. That's the goal. We just need to be praying for each other, praying with our families, and teaching our kids how to pray more in depth, because that's the relationship that we're wanting to grow and foster. And so as we look forward, this kind of connects to next week's chapter 22, and it's talking about preparing for doubts in Christianity, for the truth of Christianity. And so it's talking about, doubts are going to come. How do we deal with them as a parent, or how do we prepare to talk with our kids? Because a lot of folks, if not most folks, kind of wrestle with some doubt. And that's where we're going to be for next week. So I'm looking forward to being with you guys. Be praying this week.
Absolutely. I think it starts now. So we're excited. We'll see y'all next week.